We are going to talk about Behemoth and the Rifter series. And the first question is how came the idea of Rifters for you? What's the beginning?
Okay. We're actually
yes.
we're on the okay, we're on the IR. Okay. Rifters originally, the whole idea of Behemoth the microbe,
Yes.
basically kind of came in at the end. I was trying to write a novel revolving around the theme, the basic theme that society builds itself on the backs of its outcasts. And so you have a bunch of people who are essentially victims and victimizers, who are very low status people who essentially have their hands on a kill switch
Yes.
for all of civilization and don't realize it yet.
Okay.
And the question is, what happens when they discover that they have this kind of power? But I like to think of myself as a realist. And by reaction, or my answer to this question has always been, the moment they find out they have this kind of power, the authorities squash them like bugs,
Yes.
because nobody's going to be stupid enough to give those people that kind of power. There's going to be a kill switch. There's going to be, these people will not be allowed to exert
Yes.
their autonomy. So I needed basically a cheat. I needed some way I could sort of throw in the mix that would allow the underdog actually to have a fighting chance against winning against its masters. And that's what Behemoth started out as. I wasn't expecting the series to go past one book. I actually wrote Starfish with ending with Lenny Clark basically crawling up, half-starved onto the beach of North America, and bleeding out there, and pretty explicitly dying. But her carcass is still rotten with Behemoth, and the implication is that it's game over for DNA-based life. But my editor works for a publisher which is based in the US. And I don't know if you guys have heard it over here, but the US tends to be pretty triumphal in terms of their taste. So it was like, oh no, you can't have your protagonist die. She must be triumphant. And I said, well, this is not really a triumphant kind of story, and I'm not American, I'm Canadian, and it would really be horrible to sort of tack a Hollywood ending onto what's essentially a pretty grim story. How about we leave it ambiguous? We don't know whether she makes it to the coast or not, and we kind of leave it with her heading off there, sort of supercharged by her. Okay, yeah, we can do that. So we left the end of Starfish ambiguous. And then Starfish did really well. And Hartwell phoned me up a few months later and said, well, I'll pay you 3 times as much as we paid you for Starfish to do a sequel.
Yes.
And so at that point, I mean, the whole advantage of writing Starfish was I didn't really have to imagine a whole world, right? I just had this little one set stage play. Now I had to imagine what was going on in the rest of the world. So it was a much bigger, nastier job that I suddenly found myself faced with. But, I decided to see if I was up for it. And I should probably emphasize that getting 3 times as much for what I got paid for Starfish is really not a whole lot, because Tor really does not pay their authors very well. So it still wasn't that much, but it was nice, and and that was how Behemoth got started. Really, it was more of an afterthought. It was more of a, how do I fix this problem with the plot, rather than me sitting down and thinking, oh, I think I'm going to write a story about an apocalyptic microbe.
Yes. Do you need a lot of documentations? How do you work?
Well, it's in the case of the Rifters trilogy. You could say, in a sense, that I've been researching it for 15 years before I started it, because my formal background's in marine biology, right? Starfish came out in 1999. I went into my first university course in, I think, 1976, a BSc in marine biology. So I suppose you could say all that time was spent researching it, which was not explicitly the case, of course. So in that case, there was a lot of stuff that I did not have to explicitly research, because I just knew it in the course of getting my degrees. That said, there's a bunch of other stuff I kind of made up, and there is some stuff that I had to research, the impact of high pressure on neural synaptic firing and so on. I had to do a fair bit of research with that. But I found that the further I've gotten in my career, the more research I have to do, because the less relevant my own expertise. I mean, my own expertise isn't even relevant in marine biology anymore because it's so old. But now I'm not even writing it large. I mean, Maelstrom happened largely out of the water, right? Half of Behemoth happened out of the water. Blindsight and echopraxia happen in outer space. So whatever scientific expertise I had that served me in starfish evaporated quite rapidly. And now, yeah, I have to do a shitload of research. And it really kind of pisses me off because I would love to do more reading for pleasure. But every time I pick up a book I want to read for pleasure, like a new episode of New Scientist or Science or Nature comes down and there's something that I've got to read and I can only understand 10% of it, but I still have to read it because otherwise I'll fall behind the curve and my science will not be cutting edge and people will laugh at me and turn away.
You talk with scientific and professor?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I have a lot of... for example, the protagonist in the book that hasn't come out yet, but which I've just handed in, Echopraxia, it's based on a parasitologist that I know quite well. Some of the talkier bits in Maelstrom came from an old microbiology prof I had up in Guelph, Dennis Lynn. But so there are still old contacts, and certainly I still have people in academia who will get me past the paywall, so I don't have to pay $1,000 for a bunch of different scientific subscriptions to magazines. I can basically use their credentials to get in, and that's all great. More surprisingly, though, are people who have shown up since then that I don't know, who have read my earlier stuff and liked it. And as soon as they say that they like my stuff, I immediately sort of hook into them, put their name on a list, and every time, so I've got computer scientists, I've got astronomers and cosmologists, I've got neuroscientists, and these are people who, for the most part, I've never actually met face to face, but I have seized upon them when they said they liked my stuff to say, oh, so can I pick your brains if I have to ask you about this, that, or the other thing? And that's proven really helpful too. I basically have an army of experts that make me appear much smarter than I really am.
We talk about science, but in your books we have some rich who live on the sea, in the sea.
Behemoth you're talking about, yes.
Okay. Is it a social book too? What
I don't
do you
know.
want to...
The sociological aspects.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, maybe a better word than sociological would be political. And yeah, but I don't like to. I mean, maybe I am preachy. I don't know. I don't like to be preachy. I don't know if it's possible to write a book involving human conflict on that kind of a scale without involving politics. If you do, it's going to be a pretty superficial book. I certainly do have a particular viewpoint about how I regard authority structures, how I regard governments. And my perspective is generally pretty biologically oriented. So I tend to regard certain types of politicians as a kind of parasite. And parasites have a place in the ecosystem. I tend to sort of have an anthropologist view of things like sociopathy. So I think some people have found my biological perspective. I've seen that I basically look at human beings from a biological perspective, and they misinterpret that as cynicism. Because certainly no regular person would think that we are just animals. We are, the exalted, we are the pinnacle of God's creation, we have souls. So anybody who thinks of human beings in ecological or neurochemical terms, who treats humans as mere animate objects subject to the same rules of Darwinian selection as anything else, obviously I'm a cynic. But where I come from, that's not a cynical point of view. I mean, I'm a biologist by background. That's how we all think. That's what we are. We are mammals. So while I do while I will cop to being bitter about a lot of things, I don't think I'm cynical. And that said, yes, there is definitely a political element in everything I write.
Okay. In your books and your short story, we are always very surprising by the form of life you event, like Nimbus, for example. I don't know if
Nimbus, yeah, it translates as Nimbus. It's the same word in both languages.
Great. What interests you by invent this sort of life, the alien life, or?
Well, now Nimbus is kind of an anomaly. In most cases, I'm frankly kind of rolling my eyes at how most people envision alien life. Again, as a biologist, I get kind of tired of the standard Star Trek aliens with the bumpy foreheads, and you know, even when you look at the written literature, you frequently get non-human aliens, but they're either kind of, you know, Robert Heinlein's Starship Trooper bugs, where you have, you know, they're basically rabid dogs in chitin, or you have something that looks a lot different from us, but thinks pretty much like a human being. Or you have, you know, a hive mind that doesn't really explore the ramifications of what would go into a hive mind. So there's a part of me that wants to examine that stuff from a biological perspective. One of my stories that I'm most fond of is called The Island. And that dealt with, amongst other things, essentially a live Dyson sphere, a thin, tenuous membrane of tissue sort of surrounding an entire sun, this big photosynthetic blob of tissue. I have no idea how it could have evolved, but it was still something that was a nice idea to play with. Nimbus, on the other hand, was just my girlfriend at the time looked out the window and there was the storm front moving in, and she said, "Boy, look at those storm clouds. They look almost alive."
Yes.
And so on that basis, I sat down and wrote Nimbus. And Nimbus is, of course, I thought was pure bullshit, because the idea of, you know, super intelligent or microbes in the clouds changing the world's weather. And then, 10 years after I wrote Nimbus, which, let me repeat, I did absolutely no research for, it was just a complete brain fart. 10 years after this, an Israeli-British scientific expedition started sending planes up into the clouds with giant mist nets trying to catch microbes which they thought were affecting global weather patterns. And apparently they found some.
Yeah?
Yeah. Now, they're certain, as far as we know, they're not sort of, you know, they're not, these clouds are, these cloud microbes are not getting together to try and wipe out humanity. But still, it's kind of interesting that I just basically threw a dart over my shoulder with no expertise whatsoever and happened to hit that one tiny little bullseye. I thought that was pretty cool.
Nimbus is very interesting because we have a problem between a father and his daughter. Mm-hmm. And in all your books, what is the most important? The communication between the characters, the story, or the biological aspect for you, or maybe all of this?
I don't know. Generally speaking, when I sit down to write a story or a book, I'm exploring an idea. I'm saying, suppose this were the case, what would be the ramifications? So it's a thought experiment. And I think one of my failings as a writer is that I tend to, because I'm exploring an idea, the next step is, okay, how can I come up with characters that will illustrate this idea? And so the characters tend to become more like icons or mouthpieces for a particular. And in some cases it seems to work. Like there is a definite character-based element in Nimbus. In Starfish, Lenny Clark, the character of Lenny Clark was actually based on somebody I knew who I was trying to understand. In that way, it was kind of it was also a thought experiment, but it was a thought experiment in terms of what do I do to get through with you? like it's and I have no idea I have no idea whatsoever if my guesses about what went on behind that mask are true or not. In fact, I thought she was dead until about a year ago. I've just found out that she's living in an old folks' home in the Okanagan. But so I think in some cases I can come up with decent characters. And yes, always the drama is important. I mean, I've just, over the past 3 days before I came here, I just eliminated 2,000 words from echopraxia, realizing that instead of having people talking about something, I could just spring it on them in action and then have them try to deal with the emotional consequences afterwards. So I'm always cognizant of trying to communicate things through character, not through ideas. But that's how I fix something I've written. That's not how I start writing. And I can come up with good characters when, in fact, I sort of take my own emotional problems with other people and sort of project them onto the story. But the skeleton of the story is always the idea. And as a result, those characters don't emerge naturally. I sort of staple the characters on afterwards. And so people could quite legitimately say that I'm a crappy character. I'm crappy at writing characters.
When we talk with other authors, a lot of them talk with their characters. They like friends, imaginary friends, but friends and you. They are alive.
I don't think I've ever done that. There's never been... I don't think there's ever been a point at which I've sort of closed my eyes and had a dialogue with one of my characters. There have been times when I've thought, oh, the story has to get here. How can my character get us there? And then maybe I have to change the character because he or she wouldn't go there on his or her on their own. But no, you're right. I've heard that in the past, but I've never done it. I've never talked to one of my characters. I mean, damn it, they're my goddamn characters. They'll do what I tell them to.
Great. Last question. What are you working now?
I've just finished Echopraxia, which is the sequel to Blindsight.
Okay.
It's going to be coming out in North America in August, next August 2014. I expect it'll be coming out here shortly thereafter because Benedict has already bought it. So I guess it's just a question of my agent passing her the manuscript. After that, there's I'm doing some I'm doing some video game work.
Yes.
That I'm not yet allowed to talk about because it's still sort of up in the air. In my experience, and I've had a few experiences with the video game industry, what happens is I do initial work for them, and everybody on the factory floor that I deal with really, really likes it. And then some new executive producer is brought in from Texas, and he fires everybody that I knew and replaces them with his girlfriends and nephews. And then that's the last I see of the gig. So I have no idea how long. I don't know if this gig will last as long as the others or if it will go longer. But if and when it does crash and burn, the next novel I want to write is sort of a near future techno thriller set in a climate change scenario where most of the Canadian Arctic has turned to slush. It starts with an attack on a scuba diver by a vengeful lobster, which is actually based on a real life experience I had once while diving out in the Bay of Fundy. And this guy, after fending off the lobster, comes up onto his boat, finds himself abducted by the Canadian version of the CIA, who take him up to Frobisher Bay, where two genetically engineered giant squid have just destroyed an American oil head.
Okay.
Oil, and it goes from there, and it basically, it is an overtly political book. It's called Intelligent Design because it basically deals with how all sorts of things that look like they are intelligently designed aren't necessarily intelligently designed. And it ends up essentially inside the banking computers of Bears and Stearns and who is that vampire squid? sucking the lifeblood off the face of the human race. Goldman Sachs.
Yes.
Yeah, so it starts off essentially in the Canadian Arctic, but it hops over the world a little bit and spends a lot of time inside computer systems, which is something that should be familiar to anyone who's read Maelstrom.
Okay.
So we'll be getting, it's almost like an earlier version of Maelstrom in that aspect of it.
Okay.
I don't have a contract for it or anything, I just want to write it.
Okay.
So we'll see how it goes.
Great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.